We are back talking about night part three. Part three is going to pick up at the beginning of chapter five. This is immediately following the scene with the hanging of the sad eyed angel. At the beginning of chapter five, we are looking far more at what's happening inside of Eli's heart and mind with a severe crisis of his faith. It starts in September, which is when the holiday of Rosh Hashanah is celebrated. And this is September of 1944, keeping in mind that in April of 1945, the very next year, just a few months away, he will be liberated from the camps. The summer was coming to an end. The Jewish year was almost over. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the last day of that cursed year, the entire camp was agitated and every one of us felt the tension. After all, this was a day unlike all others, the last day of the year. The word last had an odd ring to it. What if it really were the last day? The evening meal was distributed, an especially thick soup, but nobody touched it. We wanted to wait until after prayer. On the apple plot, surrounded by electrified barbed wire, thousands of Jews, anguish on their faces, gathered in silence. Night was falling rapidly, and more prisoners kept coming from every block, suddenly able to overcome time and space and to will both into submission. What are you, my God? I thought angrily. How do you compare to this stricken mass gathered to affirm to you their faith, their anger, their defiance? What does your grandeur mean, master of the universe, in the face of all this cowardice, this decay, and this misery? Why do you go on troubling these poor people's wounded minds, their ailing bodies? Some 10,000 men had come to participate in a solemn service, including the Blockel test, the capos, all bureaucrats in the service of death. Blessed be the Almighty, the voice of the officiating inmate had just become audible. At first I thought it was the wind. Blessed be God's name. Thousands of lips repeated the benediction, bent over like trees in a storm. Blessed be God's name? Why? But why would I bless him? Every fiber in me rebelled. Because he caused thousands of children to burn in his mass graves? Because he kept 6 crematoria working night and day, including Sabbath and the holy days? Because in his great might he had created Auschwitz, Birkenau, Buna, and so many other factories of death? How could I say to him, Blessed be thou, Almighty Master of the universe, who chose us among all nations to be tortured day and night, to watch as our fathers, our mothers, our brothers end up in the furnaces? Praised be thy holy name for having chosen us to be slaughtered on thine altar? I listened as the inmate's voice rose. It was powerful yet broken, amid the weeping, the sobbing, the sighing of the entire congregation. All the earth and universe are God's. He kept pausing, as though he lacked the strength to uncover the meaning behind the text. The melody was stifled in his throat, and I, the former mystic, was thinking, yes, man is stronger, greater than God. When Adam and Eve deceived you, you chased them from paradise. When you were displeased by Noah's generation, you brought down the flood. When Sodom lost your favor, you caused the heavens to rain down fire and damnation. But look at these men whom you have betrayed, allowing them to be tortured, slaughtered, gassed, and burned. What do? They pray before you. They praise your name. All of creation bears witness to the greatness of God. In days gone by, Rosh Hashanah had dominated my life. I knew that my sins grieved the Almighty, and so I pleaded for forgiveness. In those days, I fully believed that the salvation of the world depended on every one of my deeds, on every one of my prayers. But now I no longer pleaded for anything. I was no longer able to lament. On the contrary, I felt very strong. I was the accuser, God the accused. My eyes had opened, and I was alone, terribly alone in a world without God, without man, without love or mercy. I was nothing but ashes now, but I felt myself to be stronger than this Almighty to whom my life had been bound for so long. In the midst of these men assembled for prayer, I felt like an observer, a stranger. The service ended with Kaddish. Each of us recited Kaddish for his parents, for his children, and for himself. We remained standing in the apple plots for a long time, unable to detach ourselves from this surreal moment. Then came the time to go to sleep, and slowly the inmates returned to their blocks. I thought I heard them wishing each other a happy new year. I ran to look for my father. At the same time, I was afraid of having to wish him a happy year in which I no longer believed. He was leaning against the wall, bent shoulders sagging as if under a heavy load. I went up to him, took his hand, and kissed it. I felt a tear on my hand. Whose was it? Mine? His? I said nothing, nor did he. Never before had we understood each other so clearly. The sound of the bell brought us back to reality. We had to go to bed. We came back from very far away. I looked up at my father's face, trying to find a glimpse, a smile, or something like it on his stricken face, but there was nothing, not the shadow of an expression. Defeat. Yom Kippur. This is celebrated in October, so October of 44. The Day of Atonement. Should we fast? The question was hotly debated. To fast could mean a more certain, more rapid death. In this place, we were always fasting. It was Yom Kippur year round. But there were those who said we should fast precisely because it was dangerous to do so. We needed to show God that even here, locked in hell, we were capable of singing his praises. I did not fast. First of all, to please my father, who had forbidden me to do so. And then there was no longer any reason for me to fast. I no longer accepted God's silence. As I swallowed my ration of soup, I turned that act into a symbol of rebellion, of protest against him, and I nibbled on my crust of bread. Deep inside me, I felt a great void opening. When we look at the relationship between Eli and his father, you can see that they are very much in a very tight place right now. They're in a place where they can be emotional with each other, where all of the pretense of barriers and being proper have all been washed away with everything that they have experienced. He even like straight up says, like, I took his hand and I kissed it and I felt a tear on it. And I didn't know whether it was my dad's or it was mine because we were in the same place together. At the same token, as far as who is taking care of whom, you can see that father specifically said, you're not going to fast. You're going to continue eating. And he obeys his father. Now, he obeys his father for two reasons. One, because he's his father, and two, because he is having a tremendous crisis of faith right now, and he is very angry at God and what he perceives God has done to him and to his people. For that reason, he does choose to eat. But as far as the relationship between he and his dad, that is very, very tight. The remainder of chapter 5, which I'm going to skip over right this second, covers a second selection where they have to go through. They are not asked any questions this time because at this point they're being treated like animals, and you don't ask animals questions. And that's how they're being treated. So they have to run in front of a panel of doctors who have their numbers written down, and they run in front of them naked because again they're being treated like animals, and the doctors want to see if these people are still capable of working for them. So they do. Eli survives. Eli's friends survive. His father believes that he survives. His father has to actually go through a second selection in which father proves that he is worthy of living. You have to know that he is doing that because he wants to be strong for his son. After that scene with the selection, it turns into winter time. And when it turns into winter time, things get very, very hard for all the prisoners. They get very, very hard for Eli's dad, who is not handling this as well. It gets very hard for Eli because he has a swelling in his foot and has to go into the hospital. There is a Jewish doctor there in the hospital in Buna. They do have a hospital in Buna because that's where their workforce is located, and they want to do everything they can to protect their workers or to keep them able to work. So he has surgery on his foot. The day after he has surgery on his foot, they realize that the Russians are getting very close to them, and that is January of 1945. Now, a little history at the beginning of World War II, Hitler decided it was a really great idea if he pushed his army into Russia and did horrible things there, thinking he was going to be able to take it over. And they killed lots of people and made the Russians very mad. And then winter came, and the Nazi soldiers were not prepared for a Russian winter, so they had to pull back. Well, at the end of the war, when the Russians got themselves properly mobilized with their army, they came through with a vengeance, which means when the guards in Auschwitz in Poland could hear the Russians coming, the Nazis were scared of retribution. And so they were packing up the camp and they were heading everybody out. Ely has a choice at the end. And the choice is either he can stay in the hospital and he can recuperate with his foot because his foot is not healed yet and it's not closed yet, or he can stay in the hospital and have his dad entered into the hospital as some kind of orderly. They choose to go on the march with everybody else. They do not choose to stay behind the hospital because the thought was if we stay in the hospital, everybody's going to be killed who can't move. And it was a correct statement, but the Nazis did run out of time. And it turns out after the war, they were quite simply liberated by the Russians 2 days after the evacuation. Um, but again, the plan was to blow everything up. The guards ran out of time. So Ely and his dad choose to go in January of 1945 on what becomes known as the Death March. And that is chapter 6 that we are going to read together. Chapter 6 starts by an icy wind was blowing violently, but we marched without faltering. The SS made us increase our pace. Faster, you tramps, you fleet-ridden dogs. Why not? Moving fast made us feel a little warmer. The blood flowed more readily in our veins. We had the feeling of being alive. Faster, you filthy dogs. We were no longer marching. We were running like automatons or robots. The SS were running as well, weapons in hand. We looked as though we were running from them. The night was pitch black. From time to time, a shot exploded in the darkness. They had orders to shoot anyone who could not sustain the pace. Their fingers on the triggers, they did not deprive themselves of the pleasure. If one of us stopped for a second, a quick shot eliminated the filthy dog. I was putting one foot in front of the other like a machine. I was dragging this emaciated body that was still such a weight. If only I could have shed it. Though I tried to put it out of my mind, I couldn't help thinking there were two of us, my body and I hated that body. I kept repeating to myself, don't think, don't stop, run. Near me, men were collapsing into the dirty snow. Gunshots. A young boy from Poland was marching beside me. His name was Zalman. He had worked in the electrical material depot in Buna. People mocked him because he was forever praying or meditating on some Talmudic question. For him, it was an escape from reality, from feeling the blows. All of a sudden, he had terrible stomach cramps. My stomach aches, he whispered to me. He couldn't go on. He had to stop a moment. I begged him, wait a little, Zalman. Soon we will all come to a halt. We cannot run like this to the end of the world. But while running, he began to undo his buttons and yelled to me, I can't go on. My stomach is bursting. Make an effort, Zalman. Try. I can't go on, he groaned. He lowered his pants and fell to the ground. That's the image I have of him. I don't believe he was finished off by an SS, for nobody had noticed. He must have died, trampled under the feet of the thousands of men who followed us. I soon forgot him. I began to think of myself again. My foot was aching. I shivered with every step. Just a few more meters and it will all be over. I'll fall. A small red flame, a shot. Death enveloped me. It suffocated me. It stuck to me like glue. I felt I could touch it. The idea of dying, of ceasing to be, began to fascinate me. To no longer exist. To no longer feel the excruciating pain of my foot. To no longer feel anything, neither fatigue nor cold, nothing. To break rank, to let myself slide to the side of the road. My father's presence was the only thing that stopped me. He was running next to me, out of breath, out of strength, desperate. I had no right to let myself die. What would he do without me? I was his sole support. These thoughts were going through my mind as I continued to run, not feeling my numb foot, not even realizing I was still running, that I still owned a body that galloped down the road among thousands of others. When I became conscious of myself again, I tried to slow my pace somewhat, but there was no way. These human waves were rolling forward and would have crushed me like an ant. By now, I moved like a sleepwalker. I sometimes closed my eyes and it was like running while asleep. Now and then, someone kicked me violently from behind. I would wake up. The man in back of me was screaming, run faster. If you don't want to move, let us pass you. But all I had to do was to close my eyes to see a whole world pass before me, to dream of another life. The road was endless. To allow oneself to be carried by the mob, to be swept away by blind fate. When the SS retired, they were replaced, but no one replaced us. Chilled to the bone, our throats parched, famished, out of breath, we pressed on. At this point, you can continue to see the relationship evolve between Ely and his dad. Um, Ely seems very done. He seems very over it. He is fascinated by the idea of no longer moving, of no longer hurting. And at the end of chapter 5, he was not able to find a shoe to put on his foot. The wound, the incision that the doctor had made was open and blood was running out into the snow. So he is running in the snow with an open wound and no shoe on it. This is not a good scenario for him. He's over it. But daddy, even though he's also hurting, even though he's also struggling, Ely has no desire to disappoint or hurt his dad. So he stays. He continues fighting to make sure that his father's going to keep fighting. And you know that dad is having a hard time right now, considering the fact that he almost didn't pass that second selection that happened in chapter 5. And now they're running and running and running, and nobody's stopping because they are literally running away from the Red Army because the Nazi guards are scared of them. And guys, if the Nazis are scared of them, you know there must be something to it. We were the masters of nature, the masters of the world. We had transcended everything death, fatigue, our natural needs. We were stronger than cold and hunger, stronger than the guns and the desire to die. Doomed and rootless, nothing but numbers. We were the only men on earth. At last, the morning star appeared in the gray sky. A hesitant light began to hover on the horizon. We were exhausted. We had lost all strength, all illusion. The commandant announced that we had already covered 20 kilometers since we left. Long since we had exceeded the limits of fatigue. Our legs moved mechanically, in spite of us, without us. A little perspective here that is 12.4 miles. Repeat. That is 12.4 miles where they have been running nonstop without a break. If they stopped, you saw what happened. You would either get trampled or you would get shot. So for 12.4 miles, these people who have not eaten a decent meal in at the very least a few months, if not a couple of years. I mean, it's January now. Ely and his dad got there in May of last year. His father almost didn't pass the second selection, and they just did continuous motion for 12.4 miles. Do you know how long the cross country trail is? 3.1. This is 4 times that, and they have not been allowed to stop. Do you know how long it is from East Lincoln to Burkdale? I know that traffic is really obnoxious and it feels like forever, but from East Lincoln to Burkdale is 9 miles. They moved 3 miles past Burkdale without stopping. We came to an abandoned village. Not a living soul. Not a single bark. Houses with gaping windows. A few people slipped out of the ranks, hoping to hide in some abandoned building. 1 hour more of marching, and at last the order to halt. As one man, we let ourselves sink into the snow. My father shook me. Not here. Get up. A little farther down, there is a shed over there. Come. I had neither the desire nor the resolve to get up, yet I obeyed. It was not really a shed, but a brick factory whose roof had fallen in. Its window panes were shattered, its walls covered in soot. It was not easy to get inside. Hundreds of prisoners jostled one another at the door. We finally succeeded in entering. Inside, too, the snow was thick. I let myself slide to the ground. Only now did I feel the full extent of my weakness. The snow seemed to me like a very soft, very warm carpet. I fell asleep. I don't know how long I slept, a few minutes or 1 hour. When I woke up, a frigid hand was tapping my cheeks. I tried to open my eyes. It was my father. Now, guys, if snow starts to feel warm to you, that's not a good sign. That's hypothermia. This is why his father's like, mm-mm, we're not going to sleep here. How he had aged since last night. His body was completely twisted, shriveled up into himself. His eyes were glazed over, his lips parched, decayed. Everything about him expressed total exhaustion. His voice was damp from tears and snow. Don't let yourself be overcome by sleep, Eleazar. It's dangerous to fall asleep in snow. One falls asleep forever. Come, my son, come, get up. Ugh, get up? How could I? How was I to leave this warm blanket? I was hearing my father's words, but their meaning escaped me, as if he had asked me to carry the entire shed on my arms. Come, my son, come. I got up with clenched teeth. Holding on to me with one arm, he led me outside. It was not easy. It was as difficult to go out as to come in. Beneath our feet, there lay men crushed, trampled underfoot, dying. Nobody paid any attention to them. We were outside. The icy wind whipped my face. I was constantly biting my lips so they wouldn't freeze. All around me what appeared to be a dance of death. My head was reeling. I was walking through a cemetery. Among the stiffened corpses there were logs of wood. Not a sound of distress. Not a plaintive cry. Nothing but mass agony and silence. Nobody asked for anyone for help. One died because one had to. No point in making trouble. I saw myself in every stiffened corpse. Soon I wouldn't even be seeing them anymore. I would be one of them. A matter of hours? "Come, Father, let's go back to the shed." He didn't answer. He was not even looking at the dead. "Come, Father, it's better there. You'll be able to lie down. We'll take turns. I'll watch over you and you'll watch over me. We won't let each other fall asleep. We'll look after each other." He accepted. After trampling over many bodies and corpses, we succeeded in getting inside. We let ourselves fall to the ground. "Don't worry, son. Go to sleep. I'll watch over you." "You first, Father. Sleep." He refused. I stretched out and tried to sleep, to doze a little, but in vain. God knows what I would have given to be able to sleep a few moments. But deep inside, I knew that to sleep meant to die, and something in me rebelled against that death. Death, which was settling in all around me silently, gently. It would seize upon a sleeping person, steal into him, and devour him bit by bit. Next to me, someone was trying to awaken his neighbor, his brother perhaps, or his comrade. In vain. Defeated. He lay down too, next to the corpse, and also fell asleep. Who would wake him up? Reaching out with my arm, I touched him. "Wake up. One mustn't fall asleep here." He half opened his eyes. "No advice," he said, his voice a whisper. "I'm exhausted. Mind your business. Leave me alone." My father, too, was gently dozing. I couldn't see his eyes. His cap was covering his face. "Wake up," I whispered in his ear. He awoke with a start. He sat up, bewildered, stunned, like an orphan. He looked all around him, taking it all in as if he had suddenly decided to make an inventory of his universe, to determine where he was and how and why he was there. Then he smiled. I shall always remember that smile. What world did it come from? Heavy snow continued to fall over the corpses. What a beautiful imagery right there. It shows how they're all connected. The door of the shed opened. An old man appeared. His mustache was covered with ice, his lips were blue. It was Rabbi Eliyahu, who had headed a small congregation in Poland. A very kind man, beloved by everyone in the camp, even by the capos in the Block L test. Despite the ordeals and deprivations, his face continued to radiate his innocence. He was the only rabbi whom nobody ever failed to address as Rabbi in Buna. He looked like one of those prophets of old, always in the midst of his people when they needed to be consoled, and strangely, his words never provoked anyone. They did bring peace. If you remember from English 1, or earlier from this semester, we had the literary term foil, Foil. The word full, or foil, depending on your accent, means a character's opposite, somebody who stands in stark contrast to them. In this case, we're looking at Eli and his dad, who are so close right now. I mean, Eli's doing everything to keep his dad alive. His dad's doing everything to keep Ellie alive. His dad's not letting his child succumb to the hypothermia, which is taking so many people away right now. And then you have that father son pairing up against the rabbi who is about to speak about his son, and watch for the differences between that father and son pairing. As he entered the shed, his eyes brighter than ever seemed to be searching for someone. "Perhaps someone here has seen my son." He had lost his son in the commotion. He had searched for him among the dying, to no avail. Then he had dug through the snow to find his body, in vain. For 3 years they had stayed close to one another. Side by side they had endured the suffering, the blows. They had waited for their ration of bread, and they had prayed. 3 years from camp to camp, from selection to selection, and now, when the end seemed near, fate had separated them. When he came near me, Rabbi Eliyahu whispered, "It happened on the road. We lost sight of one another during the journey. I fell behind a little at the rear of the column. I didn't have the strength to run any more, and my son didn't notice. That's all I know. Where has he disappeared? Where can I find him? Perhaps you've seen him somewhere." "No, Rabbi Eliyahu, I haven't seen him." And so he left, as he had come, a shadow swept away by the wind. He had already gone through the door when I remembered that I had noticed his son running beside me. I had forgotten and so had not mentioned it to Rabbi Eliyahu. But then I remembered something else. His son had seen him losing ground, sliding back to the rear of the column. He had seen him and he had continued to run in front, letting the distance between them become greater. A terrible thought crossed my mind. What if he had wanted to be rid of his father? He had felt his father growing weaker, and believing that the end was near, had thought by this separation to free himself of a burden that could diminish his own chance for survival. It was good that I had forgotten all that, and I was glad that Rabbi Eliyahu continued to search for his beloved son. And in spite of myself, a prayer formed inside of me, a prayer to this God in whom I no longer believed. "Oh God, Master of the universe, give me the strength never to do what Rabbi Eliyahu's son has done." So you have two different father and son pairings. You have Eli and his dad are doing everything to keep themselves together, and then you have the rabbi and his son. In this case, the son was willing to separate himself from his father for a better chance of survival. There was shouting outside in the courtyard. Night had fallen, and the SS were ordering us to form ranks. We started to march once more. The dead remained in the yard, under the snow, without even a marker, like fallen guards. No one recited Kaddish over them. Sons abandoned the remains of their fathers without a tear. And the guards were not concerned with picking them up because they were running from the Russians. On the road, it snowed and snowed. It snowed endlessly. We were marching more slowly. Even the guards seemed tired. My wounded foot no longer hurt. Probably frozen. I felt that I had lost that foot. It had become detached from me like a wheel fallen off a car. Never mind. I had to accept that fact. I would have to live with only one leg. The important thing was not to dwell on it, especially now. Leave those thoughts for later. He does not lose his foot, guys. If he had lost his foot or his leg, the guards would not have kept him. Our column had lost all appearance of discipline. Everyone walked as he wished, as he could. No more gunshots. Our guards surely were tired. But death hardly needed their help. The cold was conscientiously doing its work. At every step, somebody fell down and ceased to suffer. From time to time, SS officers on motorcycles drove the length of the column to shake off the growing apathy. Hold on, we're almost there. Courage, just a few more hours. We're arriving in Gleiwitz. It's another camp. These words of encouragement, even coming as they did from the mouths of our assassins, were of great help. Nobody wanted to give up now, just before the end, so close to our destination. Our eyes searched the horizon for the barbed wire of Gleiwitz. Our only wish was to arrive there quickly. By now, it was night. It had stopped snowing. We marched a few more hours before we arrived. We saw the camp only when we stood right in front of its gate. The capos quickly settled us into the barrack. There was shuffling and jostling as if this were the ultimate haven, the gateway to life. People trod over numbed bodies, trampled wounded faces. There were no cries, only a few moans. My father and I were thrown to the ground by this rolling tide. From beneath me came a desperate cry. "You're crushing me. Have mercy." The voice was familiar. "You're crushing me. Mercy, have mercy." The same faint voice, the same cry I had heard somewhere before. This voice had spoken to me one day. When? Years ago? No, it must have been in the camp. Mercy! Knowing that I was crushing him, preventing him from breathing, I wanted to get up and disengage myself to allow him to breathe, but I myself was crushed under the weight of other bodies. I had difficulty breathing. I dug my nails into unknown faces. I was biting my way through, searching for air. No one cried out. Suddenly I remembered. Juliek, the boy from Warsaw who played the violin in the Buna orchestra. Juliek, is that you? Eleazar, the 25 whiplashes. Yeah, Buna was hard on Eli. Yes, I remember. He fell silent. A long moment went by. "Juliet, can you hear me, Juliet?" "Yes," he said feebly. "What do you want?" He was not dead. "Are you all right, Juliet?" I asked, less to know his answer than to hear him speak, to know he was alive. "All right, Eleazar, all right. Not too much air. Tired. My feet are swollen. It's good to rest, but my violin." I thought he'd lost his mind. His violin? Here? What about your violin? He was gasping. I'm afraid they'll break my violin. I brought it with me." I could not answer him. Someone had lain on top of me, smothering me. I couldn't breathe through my mouth or my nose. What was running down my forehead, and this was it. The end of the road. A silent death, suffocation. No way to scream, to call for help. I tried to rid myself of my invisible assassin. My whole desire to live became concentrated in my nails. I scratched. I fought for a breath of air. I tore at decaying flesh that did not respond. I could not free myself of that mass weighing down my chest. Who knows? Was I struggling with a dead man? I shall never know. All I can say is that I prevailed. I succeeded in digging a hole in that wall of dead and dying people, a small hole through which I could drink a little air. "Father, are you there?" I asked as soon as I was able to utter a word. I knew that he could not be far from me. "Yes," a voice replied from far away, as if from another world. "I'm trying to sleep." He was trying to sleep. Could one fall asleep here? Wasn't it dangerous to lower one's guard even for a moment when death could strike at any time? Those were my thoughts when I heard the sound of a violin. A violin in a dark barrack where the dead were piled on top of the living. Who was this madman who played the violin here at the edge of his own grave? Or was it a hallucination? It had to be Juliet. He was playing a fragment of a Beethoven concerto. Never before had I heard such a beautiful sound in such silence. How had he succeeded in disengaging himself, to slip out from under my body without my feeling it? The darkness enveloped us. All I could hear was the violin, and it was as if Juliet's soul had become his bow. He was playing his life. His whole being was gliding over the strings, his unfulfilled hopes, his charred past, his extinguished future. He played that which he would never play again. I shall never forget Juliet. How could I forget this concert given before an audience of the dead and dying? Even today, when I hear that particular piece by Beethoven, my eyes close, and out of the darkness emerges the pale and melancholy face of my Polish comrade bidding farewell to an audience of dying men. I don't know how long he played. I was overcome by sleep. When I awoke at daybreak, I saw Juliet facing me, hunched over, dead. Next to him lay his violin, trampled, an eerily poignant little corpse. In the death march that they experienced in chapter 6, carrying a pencil with him would have felt like lead. He, Juliet, carried a violin. Very likely for a number of reasons. One, it could be the only thing that reminded him of home, and he carried it with him like he would have a person or a child. Two, it could have been the only thing that connected him back to his humanity, which had been systematically stripped away from him while he was in the camp. And here's the end of chapter 6. We stayed in Gleiwitz for 3 days, days without food or water. We were forbidden to leave the barrack. The door was guarded by the SS. I was hungry and thirsty. I must have been very dirty and disheveled, to judge by what the others looked like. The bread we had brought from Buna had been devoured long since, and who knew when we would receive another who when we would be given another ration? The front followed us. We could again hear the cannons very close by, but we no longer had the strength or courage to think that the Germans would run out of time, that the Russians would reach us before we could be evacuated. We learned that we would be moved to the center of Germany. On the third day, at dawn, we were driven out of the barrack. We threw blankets over our shoulders like prayer shawls. We were directed to a gate that divided the camp in two. A group of officers awaited us. A word flew through our ranks: selection. The SS officers were doing the selection, the weak to the left, those who walked well to the right. My father was sent to the left. I ran after him. An SS officer shouted at my back, "Come back!" I inched my way through the crowd. Several SS men rushed to find me, creating such confusion that a number of people were able to switch over to the right, among them my father and I. Still, there were gunshots and some dead, which means that Ely's actions to save his father's life did cost other people theirs. We were led out of the camp. After a half-hour march, we arrived in the very middle of a field crossed by railroad tracks. This was where we were to wait for the train's arrival. Snow was falling heavily. We were forbidden to sit down or to move. A thick layer of snow was accumulating on our backs. We were given bread, the usual ration. We threw ourselves on it. Someone had the idea of quenching his thirst by eating snow. Soon we were all imitating him. As we were not permitted to bend down, we took out our spoons and ate the snow off our neighbors' backs. A mouthful of bread and a spoonful of snow. The SS men who were watching were greatly amused by the spectacle. The hours went by. Our eyes were tired from staring at the horizon, waiting for the liberating train to appear. It arrived only very late that evening, an infinitely long train composed of ruthless cattle cars. The SS shoved us inside, 100 per car. We were so skinny. When everybody was on board, the convoy left. That number would have been shocking if we had talked about the fact that only 80 people were put into a car when they were first taken away from his hometown in Saget. But at this point, they no longer have the luggage that would be with them, and they're all very, very small, having been starved for the duration of the time that they were in the camps. And now that we have gotten through the death march, which is what that was called in chapter 6, they are now on a train because they are literally running away from the Russians. And they only put the people on the train they believed could survive. And that is part 3.